I think we have come to very complex questions already early in the session, because it is a difficult situation to be in, work in, suffer from. So I think it's very transparent that there is a lot of complication, but our job is to make life a little bit simple. So I think cancer as a disease and psychiatry going in, I think it fits very well into our biopsychosocial-environmental spiritual construct, because that's exactly what it is. We look at it from a mental health perspective, but if you go into serious illness, we have to think about that, and that's just the concept of psychiatry we apply into one illness, and that is cancer. And here we could apply it to diabetes, we could apply it to stroke, we could apply it to chronic renal disease. It will be the same thing, because we look after the whole person. So this can happen. So one of the things is, of course, diagnosis is important, but then what to do. So early identification, diagnosis, and then management. And in management, one of the arms would be psychopharmacology. So I don't agree, the whole international psycho-oncology arena is very psychosocial oncology driven. But I think there is a big component of psychopharmacotherapy, because ultimately what are we talking about? We are talking about reducing suffering, improving quality of life, and if we have to use psychopharmacotherapy for a short time or even for a long time, I think we must do it. So, and it needs that knowledge, expertise of a psychiatrist to put that into context. That is it something that will be okay with just psychosocial interventions? If it is not improving, should we add something, or should we add right from the beginning? So I think that's very important, and these are the reasons why Sir has already said. So it's not just about the disorders. Sometimes it's very difficult to make disorders because all the criteria that are there. So there's diagnostic complexity. Is it because of cancer? Is it because of treatment? Is it because of something else that is happening in the family? So we look at symptoms then. So you have to have psychopharmacotherapy considerations for not just disorders, but also for symptoms. One group of patients we forget all the time when discussing in psychosocial oncology is the ones with already pre-existing psychiatric disorders. People with schizophrenia, people with bipolar disorders, people with alcohol use disorders might develop cancer. So what do we do for that? And that becomes a big complex process. And of course, whatever we do, if it's going to help in quality of life and treatment adherence, if there is pain, if there is fatigue, if there is insomnia, we need to do something about it. Psychosocial interventions by themselves might help, but if they don't, what is to be done? So there's a very good interface between oncology, psychiatry, palliative care, and as Sir has shown, it is a continuum, and then we see according to that, and this is affected by the communication, how one copes. Are they adjusting to treatment, and pain and physical symptoms, because anything like this is going to be a risk factor. So we have to start with our basics about pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics. And in the cancer patient, because the treatment is going to go on, what are the main modalities? Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, newer treatments, targeted therapy, immunotherapy, newer interventions for radiation, also image-guided radiation therapy, stereotactic radiotherapy, all because you want to sort of limit the amount of organ that is exposed to that particular treatment and what is to be done for that. So, and of course surgery. So everything, there's a lot of advances in treatment and technical advances, but for us the main things are Gut flora, we know about this, so may be altered in cancer patients and in terminally ill. Surgical procedures, colonization during hospital stays, and of course the medications that are doing. And as I said, we need to know a little bit about the cancer. This is something we cannot do without. If it's cancer of oral cancers are going to be much different than pancreatic cancers, which is going to be much different from colorectal cancers, and the symptoms may change, the presentations might be different. So we need to find out whether symptom or is it disorder that we want to give the medications for. Is it for psychiatric symptoms, or are we managing psychotropic medications for physical symptoms like nausea, vomiting, pain, etc. We need to know the cancer type, as I said, the cancer stage that I said, and the treatments that are going on. Okay, it's good to say chemotherapy, but we also need to know what type of chemotherapy, because there are going to be interactions, and what is going to be a primary symptom, and as I said, pre-existing psychiatric disorder. So here's one patient for you. 40-year-old gentleman, non-small cell lung cancer. He's planned for surgery. His first presentation, he's got depressed mood, reduced sleep, anhedonia, impaired concentration, fatigue, low self-esteem, and since 2 months, sorry, there's a typo there, and he's got a history of smoking. He stopped since 1 month following diagnosis. I'm going to say I've written the symptoms, and it is a true patient. Depressive episode. I don't know yet about the pre-existing depressive episode. Would you choose an antidepressant? What antidepressant would you choose? Why?
Because unlike SSRIs, which have more of GI symptoms like nausea, vomiting, etc.
He's planned for surgery. He's come really early, and we've done this thing, so he's come for surgery. So anyway, we'll come back to it. Thank you. Yes, mirtazapine, definitely a choice, but why is this a choice? We are going to be. So the ones who are non-psychiatrists, bear with us. Bear with me rather. Non-psychiatrists, bear with me. But also please attend, because these are all important things when you are going to talk to the oncologist as well as the psychiatrist. So in all SSRIs, for whatever evidence-based guidelines that we have, it is going to be the first line. However, as Dr. Shobha always knows, has said, it is about the side effects. That gastrointestinal, it's going to be problems, and the transient anxiety that happens in a patient already going to be feeling anxiety. So you need to take care of. So you avoid fluoxetine, you avoid paroxetine, and sertraline, escitalopram would be ones with fewest drug interactions. But the problem happens is hyponatremia, because everybody either pre, post, during chemotherapy will have some amount of SIADH. People are going to be on pain, so they are going to be on some NSAID that is going to add to the gastritis, so there's more risk of GI ulcer and bleeding. And also because of pain, they are going to be on some opioids, so there's going to be serotonin syndrome. So we need to be aware of that, but still SSRIs is going to be the ones. What do we do is, again, how we do in general hospital psychiatry is plan the treatment with the symptoms. So as you said, if it is going to be more of sleep, if it is going to be sort of neuropathic pain, so you could think about venlafaxine, desvenlafaxine, duloxetine, which for the SNRIs that are there. And duloxetine now is the first line treatment for chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. For diabetes, anyway, it is there, but so we need to find out. But for this gentleman, we do not have neuropathy yet. We just have the plan for surgery, but post-surgery there could be post-thoracotomy neuropathic pain syndrome. So we need to think about that. I'm not showing off my oncology knowledge, I don't know that much, but this is just years of experience and talking to my oncology friends. But what I mean to say is that we must know about the disease. We must know something about the disease or talk to them and do that. So SNRIs, again, usual suspects of side effects, but desvenlafaxine, in my experience, it's fewer drug interactions and has been tolerated well. Atypical antidepressants, as Dr. Shobha said, it is useful when sleep, obviously appetite stimulant, and has been shown as antiemetic. It's been recently shown in trials for fatigue, but that didn't really work. The evidence didn't show that. And for symptom management of anorexia and nausea. Bupropion, especially the ones who need a little bit of activating and ones who've had smoking history. So for smoking cessation and mood, it can be considered. So again, we have to tailor the symptom with the medication rather than going blindly as to what we are, because everything is more or less the same. Effect will be more or less the same. It's going to be more less side effects and more effect. So, and bupropion, again, it's weight neutral, but in some cases there may be weight loss. So you should be avoiding it with patients with cachexia. But most of our patients are on tramadol for pain, and you don't want any interactions with tramadol because it will reduce the seizure threshold. So that is one sort of warning sign for bupropion, and especially those people who have brain mets. There was sometime a few years back when we had a lot of agomelatine coming in because people in General Hospital Psychiatry found agomelatine fantastic. The evidence in cancer isn't that great, and also can't use in renal hepatic impairment, and most of our patients will have some amount of organ impairment for some amount of time at least, so we need to be very careful. TCAs, very seldom used. A lot of American literature on psychostimulants, which I mean methylphenidate, because depending on the expected survival. So the dictum is less than 6 months survival. You can't wait for SSRIs and SNRIs to act in for 4 to 6 weeks and then keep on increasing it. So get something earlier. But of course we have a new kid on the block. Ketamine has come in, so we'll see that evidence a little bit later. But overall evidence on psychostimulants, despite the literature in the American studies, they usually single arm studies, and expected survival less than 6 months is when we use. Modafinil could be used and treatment resistance. I haven't really found much of benefit in that. And ketamine, some people are extremely pro-ketamine, but I think there is a need to be using caution for it, and we will talk about that. So, and this is the other thing which the other new kid on the block has come with, your endoxifen, is the tamoxifen, when we are going to use tamoxifen for hormone positive breast cancer patients. And the whole big thing was tamoxifen. If you started, they would have antidepressant. We would start SSRIs. SSRIs will interfere with tamoxifen metabolism to endoxifen. Endoxifen is the main metabolite which will be beneficial for cancer treatment as such. But because it doesn't happen, that is why there was recurrence. Of course, people have looked at the literature now, and they say that it may not be only the SSRIs, there may be some other mechanisms at play there. So that is why in people, and it's not just breast cancer patients who get tamoxifen, other cancer patients, anything hormone receptor positive will get tamoxifen, and hence you avoid CYP2D6 inhibitors for tamoxifen. So you definitely avoid paroxetine and fluoxetine, and moderate inhibition and low inhibition are by desvenlafaxine, venlafaxine, mirtazapine. So we should consider that and not use the ones. So I have a lot of beef with the endoxifen crowd. People have been asking me about endoxifen in cancer. So now my thing is that there are so many breast cancer patients, always so many hormone receptor breast cancer patients on tamoxifen. They have got depression. If you are talking so much on endoxifen, how did they get depression? So is that type? Is it only bipolar depression? Is it sort of a family history, bipolar depression being expressed as such? So I think although that even the endoxifen literature is, NIH has got it into their website and has said, but I don't have answers to that. So because somebody has been asking me about the endoxifen in cancer, and I couldn't find any literature on that. The main evidence as far as now is about evidence of endoxifen in bipolar depression. So, and maybe the ones who are on tamoxifen did not get any episodes of bipolar depression, which I don't know, I haven't studied them. But this is again another table that shows which are the strong SCYP2D6 inhibitors and which is less. There's a whole big list of interactions between our medications and chemotherapeutic medications. The best thing always that to do is to check on a website, either Medscape or WebMD, for any interactions which we are going to be, because if we don't check, the oncologists are definitely checking, and then they will give the referral for that, which is rightly so for this. And the second thing they gave the referral is for QT prolongation, which is also very apt for them, so that those are good. But these are the main ones that I've said, that cyclophosphamide, taxanes, vincristine, irinotecan, that is important because causes rhabdomyolysis. So we might have problems with that. These other ones don't seem to have much of interactions at all, and temozolomide has been the cornerstone of treatment for brain tumor, glioblastoma, so that is good. Platinum based is the one with all the cervical carcinoma, so that is good. But the problem comes as neuropathic pain, which then we need to have to do something about it. So this is what we have discussed about. We also need to always think, they always do a staging imaging, and they always do that to rule out about metastasis, metastasis, and it's lung cancer. So you need to think about brain mets, because it's not just going to be delirium. There will be sleep disturbances, there could be just labile mood, which may not be just depressive symptoms. So we need to think of that. So shifting gears to anxiety. So as Sir has shown, it's about 9.8 to 10%. In cancer, it is more sort of comorbid depression and anxiety. It's usually coexistent with depression, and the specific thing that Sir talked about was fear of death and death anxiety. So Dr. Vahia is sitting there, and his attitude to benzos is very well known. For the other people, I would like to ask you, what is your attitude to benzos? Use freely, Sir will kick you out of here.
Hey boss, my attitude is use it for just a few days, only in crisis, and not more than 4 weeks. Beyond 4 weeks, patient is not taking benzo, benzo is taking the patient.
Okay. So it has mellowed down over the years. Okay. So that's it. So I always remember Sir when I think about benzodiazepines, and thank you, Sir. You have redeemed my practice. So obviously, what are the anxiety symptoms we are going to, it's going to be as part of adjustment disorder, it's going to be initially with the diagnosis, and it's going to be procedural. So anything, PICC karna hai, MRI में जाना है, so and people already with pre-existing anxiety disorders, it becomes really a problem sum. And then you can't say, oh, do spiritual, oh, do relaxation, oh, think about something else, oh, meditate, nothing works. You have to get into the MRI machine. So there is no other savior than benzodiazepines at that point of time. And you're not going to get into the MRI machine every day. So it is only for a few days before and after. Settle down, bring it into control, and then do all the meditation that you want, and all the relaxation, and all the music therapy, and all the yoga. All of them are very good. I'm not demeaning anything, but we need to be prioritizing what works what. Now, benzos cannot be the shortcut to, because I don't want to talk to him, or I don't want to talk to her. Just take the medicine and go. That is also not right. So, and in the cancer literature, they do say that you have to maybe having to use it intermittently and timely. So that is it. Other things, because we don't really have the time, unless if it's generalized anxiety disorder and you are trying psychosocial interventions, and you will put an SSRI, SNRI, but then you won't think about benzodiazepines. And the other things, we don't really have systematic evidence. To be honest, for some patients, we will be using metazapine or olanzapine, quetiapine, and pregabalin. So that is there. For pregabalin, most of the patients with neuropathic pain also have anxiety, also have sleep disturbance. So pregabalin is used quite freely. So this is another patient for you, and you have to solve it for me. 38-year-old gentleman, bipolar affective disorder, on treatment, lithium 900 milligrams per day, periampullary carcinoma, planned for neoadjuvant for chemotherapy followed by surgery, and he is referred to psycho-oncology. What do we do for him? You will check the lithium level, fine.
And creatinine level.
And creatinine level, yes. Thyroid. Do we need to do something? So we have this, that we are neoadjuvant chemotherapy followed by surgery. It's periampullary carcinoma. Some not really, I don't know what is the type of chemotherapy that the person is going to get. So first is the clinical condition of the patient. My thought is, if things are going fine, please don't upset the apple cart too much, right? But then we have to think about renal functioning, and there are some chemotherapeutic drugs which are going to affect the kidneys, like the platinum and the taxane. So we need to be careful of that. Also, neoadjuvant, it's chemotherapy. People do not eat that much, people do not drink that much, and then you have the possibility of an acute kidney injury. So we need to think about that. So patient is fine without anything else going on, but this you can predict that, see, PKPD. So we have to predict that things will not be the same. So for safety, it's always better to reduce it. We have to possibly put another medication which will not affect the kidneys for that time, more frequent monitoring, and do that. So what happens with problems with lithium? Problems with bipolar disorder patients is lithium is a problem. Valproate even more of a problem. 25% with thrombocytopenia and leukopenia. So we might, and hepatic enzymes and coagulation affected. And those are difficult difficulties when we are going to go in for surgery, because a surgeon doesn't want a bleeding field, the surgeon wants a bloodless field. So we will have to reduce and change according to that. Carbamazepine, something in the cancer zone, is an absolute no-no because it's a marrow suppression, and our first thought of mood disorder is always carbamazepine apart from lithium. Lamotrigine may have its problem. Atypical antipsychotics, when we have to use risperidone or haloperidol and then see. So what did I do? I reduced the lithium, I did the monitoring weekly follow-up. There's a lot of conversation with the oncologist, told the patients and the caregivers about good oral intake, and whatever I reduced by lithium, I added a little bit of quetiapine, and the patient was well for 2 years, but disease recurred and then he passed away. So another one which is, it doesn't really come into so much of discussion in psychosocial oncology, in conferences, but for general psychiatry, this is consultation liaison, this is another one. So 39-year-old gentleman, schizophrenia, last 7 years, maintained on clozapine, 300 milligrams per day, and of course trifluperazine. Cancer of the tongue, planned for chemotherapy as borderline inoperable, and previous CBC monitoring reports not available.
Tough.
I know.
Very tough.
Very tough.
Taper the dose of clozapine for the moment.
Sorry?
Why do you want to continue with clozapine at that dose?
This is a young fellow.
This is a 39-year-old, schizophrenia last 7 years, maintained on 300 milligrams, managing, functioning, this till this cancer of the tongue has come up, and now we have to give chemotherapy.
I would for the moment reduce clozapine and wait and watch and keep a tab on the WBC count.
I would also let, if the patient able to take the medicines and food intake is okay because of the tongue thing.
Yeah, it's not affecting his nutrition and his deglutition or anything as such.
Young fellow not having any side effects, I might just continue. What doctor told.
For the benefit of the postgraduates, clozapine is a dirty drug. It affects multiple receptors. You cannot be specific on which receptors with the clozapine block. So in a case like this, when we are dealing with the unknown, reduce the dose of clozapine, monitor the patient, and only if it's indicated, go up to 300. Otherwise, wait for the time being, because with clozapine, we just don't know what can happen and the patient can start convulsing.
Okay, so I'll come to what we did, and it took a lot of work. So what are we talking about? We're talking about extrapyramidal side effects, because we've also got trifluperazine, we've also got cardiac side effects. It is going to have interactions, and clozapine we know about the blood count monitoring, which in India we did not have. Now they have taken about the clozapine patient monitoring system. We did not have that anyway, and now it's off anyway. So that's okay. But one main thing is that treatment of some long-standing psychotic disorders should not be withheld or stopped during cancer treatment, because for the oncologist gets scared and then they will just stop everything, and then they'll come back in a week later because Dr. Saab ne bola tha band kar do. But this is some conversation we have to have, and we really have to be friends with oncologists. We cannot be antagonistic with them. It doesn't help them, it doesn't help me. So it takes a lot of more relationship work goes on in oncologist than with the spouse. So then that's how important it is when you have to live with them 8 hours a day in the hospital. So anyway, things have changed now. So the anti-psychiatry oncologists are no longer in the Tata, so then that is good. All of the rest of them are all friends. So we could manage that. As Dr. Vaya said and Abid said about, I think I needed to reduce it for the timing. Patient was maintained. did the CBC, the monitoring. It was almost every 3-4 days that we did, and it was continuous conversations with the oncologist. And when things went down, we could give the granulin stimulating factor, colony stimulating factor that we did, and that helped. So it needed a close watch, but it needs to be. This is just one of the patients on clozapine. There are other patients on clozapine that we have done. So delirium, anyway, all of you are masters of managing delirium. It doesn't really change, so multifactorial, but if the patient is, it's just, again, it's post-op, so we can manage, nursing staff cannot manage, oncologists cannot manage, and it happens in the ICU. So again, the evidence as it is haloperidol, or some have said about aripiprazole, olanzapine, etc., quetiapine, but injectable, that's the only thing that is available. And for us, we use a lot of intravenous haloperidol, which you will not use. And in the ICU setting, the ICU intensivists are very good with. Now, they don't use any haloperidol. Anything happens is dexmedetomidine, and when things resolve, our patient is being transferred to the ward, then maybe we can change to haloperidol. And there is, unlike the fluoxetine pre-surgery or pre-this thing, fluoxetine, there's no evidence of antipsychotics in prevention of delirium. And this is something in the palliative care literature. They found that risperidone, haloperidol, and placebo, risperidone, haloperidol fared worse. So that's one in the palliative care literature. I have just 5 more minutes. So we've talked about cancer pain, and the green thing is the descending tract, which we need to make an impact on, because it is about perception of pain. So if we work on the descending tracts, if anything is a problem, the perception of pain may increase. So we need to do something to reduce the stimuli going up, so that we can. So the modulatory system is the serotonergic system, and that is why the SNRIs are a choice in neuropathic pain. And also there's this concept of total pain, that it is not just physical, it can be psychological, it is social, it is financial, and it is spiritual, and such things. That moral distress that Dr. Dave sir was talking about, for us, moral distress for us, there's a lot of angst and spiritual questioning, existential questioning for the patient, and all that is then affecting this particular tract going up, and we need to do something for the tract going down. So, and I'll talk to some biological mechanisms later. So neuropathic pain, again, as I said, duloxetine is the first line treatment, and venlafaxines, and of course pregabalin, gabapentin, etc. We also need to use psychotropic medications for fatigue, for nausea, vomiting, and olanzapine is the star of the show, because olanzapine affects so many receptors. All of them might be acting on the emetic pathway. So olanzapine is registered sort of for refractory pain, or refractory nausea, vomiting, also for high emetogenic drugs. We also have venlafaxine, desvenlafaxine, which can be used for hot flashes. We've got doxepin, sertraline, which can be used for pruritus, and we have memantine, which can be used for prevention of cognitive deficits for patients receiving whole brain radiation. So use of psychotropic medications can be helped. And we all know risk factors. Alcohol is one, tobacco, smoking is one, and substance use disorders with opioids. So this is a group of patients who we think are seeking for opioids, but because they're already opioid use disorders, their threshold is reset much higher. So for pain analgesia, they will need a higher dose of analgesics, and the instinct is to give them lower dose of analgesics. So then that is not going to really work because the system has set at a higher level. So we need to do something to manage withdrawal symptoms, how to do opioid substitution treatment, liaison with addiction psychiatry. So I have good links with KEM across the road, so that is good. And our job is also for prescribing and monitoring diversion. That also we don't want, so we need to be being very strict about giving the quantity. And a lot of patients will come from bells where a feme is like chai, and you won't get to know it till you take the history and something else happens and needing more opioid analgesics, and then it will be, and you can't even sort of quantify how much of a feme because we don't have any sort of equal to conversions for that. And so of course the new thing about ketamine, I know some of you love ketamine, but most of them are narrative reviews or just general reviews. The only systematic review is this, which is China, which is 5 RCTs, which is the intravenous route only, which is one single intraoperative dose. There have been different cancers in different of these triangles, and of course they have found tolerable and effective, but of course the effect does not last long, which we all know by our this. And this is for the psychedelic assisted therapies, because that's again the new thing on the block, that it's 11 RCTs and 4 single open label. Ketamine, rapid decline in depression and suicidality. Psilocybin, large effect, but it's all in the research category that will be there. And MDMA, LSD seems to be promising, but some people have started doing that. So now, I know it is all very biological, psychological, social, spiritual, environmental, but I think everything, there is only one conduit, and that is your biological mechanisms. Because cancer is an inflammatory state, so that's inflammation. Obviously there will be neuroinflammation, and that is why the risk of depression so much higher. Cancer again, upset in the immune system, and then again you can think that that is why depression, anxiety, or any of the psychiatric disorders would be higher. And these cancers, so either it's metastatic spread to the brain, pro-inflammatory cytokines, confusional states could be because of your SIADH and encephalitis. Severe depression could be due to interleukin release and tryptophan difficulties in the HPA axis. So basically it's a stress, not stress as in I'm feeling stress state, inflammation, cancer, and then the psychiatric disorders, which I think is a systemic manifestation along with the cancers. And some of the cancers, depending on the sites and depending on what they are secreting and what the cells are, is what is causing the problem. So the other side of it is 2 psychotropics are needed for psychiatric disorders and psychiatric symptoms. Seems that we could repurpose some of our medications for their anti-cancer and anti-tumor effect, because they are going to work on the same cell signaling pathways like mTOR, AKT, etc. And it's been seen that they can be synergistic with the newer targeted and immunotherapies. And people have postulated that maybe during intervening cycles, during periods between chemotherapy, radiation therapy, if they can put in psychotropic drugs to carry on with the anti-tumor activity. But of course we have to be careful about interactions. So when I have a patient in front of me, mine is whether cancer diagnosis, is it solid, it is hematolymphoid, because hematolymphoid will have its own blood work problems. What is the disease stage, whether it is curative, going in for surgery, or is it going to be systemic therapy and all the other therapies that is going to be coming in. Psychiatric history, I need some objective data, I need previous case papers, I need to make a diagnosis, either disorder or symptoms, or know as to why am I giving those medications. Need to know comorbidities, obviously, concurrent medications that is going on, and that's a common thing. You give SSRI and they are getting a 5-HT3 antagonist during their chemotherapy cycle. Then what do we do? So that's been a problem. What is the cancer treatment plan? Is it concurrent? Is it sequential? And there are lots of schedules, so we need to really know that. And that continuous talking with the oncologist, keep monitoring the investigations, always take care of drug interactions and take care of the QT intervals, and the reference for dose adjustments for renal hepatic impairment, communication and documentation, and strict follow-up. So that's a huge list, but that's the huge thing that we need to do. So thank you very much for your attention. If there are any other questions, we can take it later during lunch, because I guess we need to move on. Yes, sir. Yeah. So it also depends on we are a very hierarchical system, right, in India. So when I came in, I finished 21 years now. So when I came in, people were much senior, and some people were very skeptical why psychiatrists. When Dr. Pradhan came, he was once a week, twice a week. It's actually Savita who got me into this post, because she insisted that there should be a psychiatrist, and she insisted that there should be a full-time psychiatrist. I think for that time, in 2004, that was a very strong statement, and I work with that. So, so because we as psychiatrists also are not very sure of ourselves, and we think that we are subservient to what the big oncologist is going to tell me. And if you don't do that, then you are not really so nice. They want to, so when I came in, they said, oh, we'll send all the HAD screening to you. So then I asked a lot of questions, why are we doing HAD screening, what study is that, etc., etc. So they, as the senior ones may not have liked it. But then what I did, and this is something Dr. Chaturvedi also had come in at that time and had said, talk to them. Every referral that you get, you ask them why, and then you give them a follow-up about this. And that is how you build sort of networks and friendships, and during lunchtime, etc. And also some of us then grew up together, right? So that current director, I sort of worked with him, and now he's the director, I am so and so. And then if our equations at that level are good, then the juniors also role model on that, right? Because if the juniors role model on the seniors who scoff at psychiatry, that's not going to be good. So now if they are respectful of psychiatry, psycho-oncology, and we are in the clinics, I think that is what makes a difference. My relationship with spouse was already made so many years ago, so I didn't have to bother. I guess I do. With the spouse or with the oncologist? I don't dominate with the oncologist. They are friends now.
Jaita, I completely agree with you. Just one addition. What I learned from my experience at Breach Candy. when a physician or an oncologist says something which is absolutely unacceptable, never say no, you're wrong. Always say, of course you are right, but, and then tell them how their argument is flawed. If you begin with saying that you are wrong,
Yeah.
they don't like it. That's
Yeah.
one. There was somebody who said use benzodiazepines freely. To that, my answer: one, benzodiazepines suppress the symptoms. They do not resolve the psychology or the biology of anxiety. 3, they produce cognitive deficit. 4, they facilitate putting suicidal thoughts into ideas. 4, they block new learning. They produce state-dependent learning. They block new learning. A patient of cancer has to learn to live with cancer or the side effects of the treatment. And 4, increase the risk of fall. So these are the 5 reasons why benzodiazepines, use them. I am not against use of benzodiazepines. I am absolutely against irrational use of benzodiazepines. Not more than 4 weeks, minimum dose. In my practice, every time I prescribe benzodiazepine, I write underneath, caution, potentially habit forming. 9 out of 10 patients, in spite of the prescription, don't take benzodiazepine. That's 1. 2, pregabalin and gabapentin in your practice. Pregabalin is habit forming, so it's out. But gabapentin for patients of insomnia and anxiety, any experience?
So, pregabalin, gabapentin, both can be addictive. So is tramadol, tapentadol, everything can be addictive. For neuropathic pain, we have to give it because we are seeing patients with, in best supportive care only. For those who can be not given, and the treatment will result in the, pain being less, because the disease modifying treatment will obviously reduce the pain as well. So we can reduce that. I don't use it for sleep. I have started, I use usually melatonin if ordinary sleep hygiene sleep hygiene measures don't help. So I have been using melatonin. And I think poor Soumitra, he just got shouted at by you. He just meant it as a joke, sir, freely.
I'm not quarreling, I'm just kind of putting up the information.
So Vaya's chapter in the practical guidelines, few years ago, practical guidelines for a psychiatrist to use the medicines. He has been always anti
Irrational use of benzodiazepines.
rational.
Sir, I quote the
Yeah.
white paper of the Royal College of Psychiatrists as well as the guidelines from the American Psychiatric Association.
Yes.
We tried to put that in the guidelines of
Scientifically-
Indian Psychiatric Society, and our president was like him, use it freely.
Yeah.
We had a big conflict. After that I have stopped participating in the guidelines.
Very true. And but I have seen in delirious patient, especially post-operative cancer patients, only haloperidol doesn't work well. And I have been seeing patients where they have already given Serenase, and still patient is delirious and not sleeping for 1 or 2 days. I suggest midazolam IV for at least a day or so. But a patient is bedridden, so there is no question of fall or something like that. But I fully agree with you that SSRI, anxiety disorders, later on is going to be the line of treatment. But difficulty is this: the patients who have taken benzodiazepine, they are not liking to start with escitalopram or SSRI, and that becomes a difficult thing. And before prescribing benzodiazepine, what you suggest is a counseling is needed, that this is for a temporary use and otherwise you are going to have a harmful effect. I fully agree with you.
Sir, there is one thing I learned, and for which I have still not found any literature. I work with a very senior physician whose one mandate is that when he comes on the round, he should be able to talk to the patient. When he comes on the round, the patient is not awake, he gets very upset. That made me experiment with different patterns of administering haloperidol even in patients of delirium. And I found haloperidol drops somehow work very well. I start with 2 drops at night, make it 2 drops twice a day, go up to 5 drops twice a day. It somehow works. I don't know why. It's oral, so there is no first pass effect. That's one explanation. But it tranquils the patient without sedating him. There is no reference on this, but I have found this.
I just wanted to comment on alprazolam withdrawal delirium, which I see very often. Like, people are addicted to 0.5 milligrams, 1 milligram, and then suddenly post-surgery, post-admission that is stopped, and they go into delirium, and the only thing that you have to do is reinstate the alprazolam. So just wanted to bring attention to that.
So if you go by books, then benzodiazepines only for alcohol withdrawal delirium, benzodiazepines only for terminal delirium, right? Those are the two things that are there. So for the alprax, it happens because everybody comes in with the alprax, right? We are not the ones. We all follow GERD, but the other people have it also, right? So then everybody comes in. All physicians have prescribed alprazolam anyway. So what we don't need is because post-surgery, then you don't want them to be sedated. Post-surgery, for any surgery, especially head neck, then you don't want the sedation, you don't want the respiratory depression. So then that becomes, so it is tough, but we have to manage doing other things. And plus post-surgery also, they are nearby now. There is nothing else other than that haloperidol in our so we manage for those 3-4 days, and as soon as they are able to, then maybe this thing. So I use olanzapine for a lot of symptom management. It works well on mood, it works well on sleep, and sometimes when you are really not sure what the diagnosis is, olanzapine, because of its receptor profile, because anyway it's a chota brother of clozapine, because of the receptor profile, it works really well, 2.5 milligrams, and then reduces. Thank you. Yeah,